Welcome back to part two, nutrition for selection. In part one, we talked about how to improve your bone resiliency or how to decrease your risk for bone stress injuries through the train up phase and then through the selection phase. So today, what we're going to be talking about is how to increase your immune resiliency or how to create a more robust immune system through gut health. Why this is important through the selection process is to help prevent any issues associated with infections, illness, and in particular, respiratory infections. Respiratory infections are actually pretty common during selection, especially if we're talking about those selection processes that can extend past 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks. So I'm Susan Lopez, tactical dietitian, and this is the Tactical Nutrition and Performance Podcast, where we help tactical athletes bridge the gap between nutrition, metabolism, supplements, sleep, stress, and training so that they can perform better and live longer. Welcome back. So part one was filled with a lot of information on micronutrients that you need to consider putting into your diet or supplementing with in order to increase bone resiliency. And so if you want to watch that episode before you dive into this one or listen, make sure you check the show notes below so that you can watch part one and then come back and dive into part two. Now, when we talk about immune health and immune resiliency, we have to additionally talk gut health. And the reason for this is because so much of your immune system is produced by the gut, up to 70%. The gut is often called the second brain. You guys might be familiar with this information. There is a lot that happens there. There's a lot of crosstalk between the gut and the brain. There's a lot of stimulation from the top down and from the bottom up through the nervous system. And so stress physiology also plays a huge role in what's happening within your gut and then potentially what could be happening within your immune system. For selection in particular, there are situations in which you might need to rely on your immune system to get you through certain phases. And so some common examples would be, if you get an injury, you get scratched, right? It's not uncommon to be dirty during selection, and being able to fight off infections is going to be really important. Things like cellulitis, things like staph can sometimes occur during selection. Upper respiratory infections are also common during the selection process. And if you go back to part one where we talked about vitamin D, I should probably point out that vitamin D is also associated with greater resiliency to upper respiratory infections. This was research that came out specifically during the COVID era. When we look at what's happening within the gut and we need to define gut health, we should define that by thinking about the diversity of the gut microbiome. We should define that by thinking about transit time through the digestive tract and the health of your bowels, meaning how frequently and how often you poop. These are all questions that as a dietitian that I would ask you. How's your hunger level, your appetite? Are you pooping? How often are you pooping? What's the consistency like? I know it's weird for people to talk about that, but that's something that's normal fodder for a performance dietitian. And when it comes to gut health, we have to know those things. So when we look at gut health and your immune system, we want to try to think about it in sort of a phasic situation when it comes to train up and then selection and then the recovery process. So in the proactive phase of training before we go off to selection, one of the things that we can do to enhance your immune resiliency for selection is going to be to increase the diversity of your gut microbiome. So if you haven't done any research or heard much about the gut microbiome, what it essentially is it's all the bacteria that lives within your digestive tract. This is going to include the good bacteria, the bad bacteria. Ideally, what we want is we want more of the good bacteria. The good and the bad bacteria are constantly fighting for dominion inside of the gut. And the things that we do, our lifestyle, our sleep habits, our eating habits, our drinking habits, our stress levels, are all going to impact who's going to win that battle at certain times within our life. And if you're somebody who's ever been under a lot of stress, whether it be physical or emotional, and you've noticed that during that time your bowel habits are not great, maybe your appetite changes, right? This is a example of what can happen to the gut and to the gut microbiome when you're under a lot of stress. Now, this gut microbiome carries a lot of power within our body. And what we're starting to see in research is how it affects not only our immune system, but also the way that we think, our cognitive performance, even our decision-making processes, our moods. There's even some research looking at how it impacts bone health. And if you could think about it like this, if you think of your gut microbiome as the ocean on the earth, and we've only explored 10% or less of the ocean, we probably know even less than that about the gut microbiome. So there's new research coming out all the time. What we do know is that certain stressors can make a big impact. So in that proactive phase, what we're looking to do is to get the gut as healthy as possible, increase the biodiversity of the gut microbiome. One of the other things we want to look at, and this is really common in some of the athletes I work with, is gastric motility, how fast things move through the digestive tract. And we may not go into depth in this today, but what can happen is if you're not doing a great job of being able to digest and extract nutrients from your food and then use it in a non-stressed situation, you're going to be just as not good at it, or even worse in a very stressed situation, when you're trying to consume adequate volumes of food, when you're trying to consume as much food as possible during a calorie deprived state. You're going to experience potentially more nausea, more bloating, more cramping, more loss of appetite than somebody who has good nutrition habits otherwise. When we are looking at increasing the biodiversity of the gut microbiome in this proactive stage, this is going to include intake of certain foods that contain the probiotics or the good bacteria that we want to get into our system. Kimchi, kefir, yogurt that has active live cultures in it, tempeh, anything pickled, fermented is typically going to be recommended. Sauerkraut is another really great one. Of course, you can supplement probiotics, but it's always a good idea, of course, to get as much as possible from real food if you have that opportunity. When we are wanting to support the good bacteria that we're taking in and that also lives in our gut microbiome, one of the nutrients that we want to focus on for this is going to be fiber intake. We talk about fiber in terms of being good for the digestive tract. It's like the broom for your digestive tract, kind of cleans everything out, gets things moving. But the good bacteria also feeds on fiber. And so we want to make sure that we have adequate amounts in our system. For every 1,000 calories that you consume, you're going to want to get in about 15 grams of fiber is the typical recommendation. For most individuals in the train-up phase, this is going to be anywhere between 45 to maybe 55 grams of fiber per day. If you don't normally consume that much fiber, just move up slowly. We don't want to go from consuming 15 grams of fiber a day to 55. That can definitely cause some digestive distress. Best foods for this are typically going to be your vegetables, your fruits with the skin on. You can definitely get some whole grains in there. Typically, what I'll tell someone is, hey, if you can incorporate 2 fibrous foods at each meal, that's probably going to be a benefit to you. The times when we would want to avoid foods that are too high in fiber, of course, is going to be during that pre-workout carbohydrate loading situation or when we're taking in those pre-training carbs. Because fiber does digest slowly, we want to make sure that it's not sitting in our gut when we're trying to train. Some other things that we want to consider are training the gut to be able to take in high amounts or high volumes of food. And I kind of mentioned this earlier. Now, there are some selections where you're just going to take in whatever they give you, and that's all you're going to have. And often you're going to be calorie deprived. There are some selections where you're going to be able to take in whatever you need. You're going to be able to have supplements. Food is going to be more readily available. Now, when we look at the foods that you're going to be eating during a selection process, with the exception of a couple, in most cases, you're going to be taking in a lot of military chow. And this can include these are meals ready to eat. These are proportionate to the way they are for a specific reason. In most cases, they're going to have a carbohydrate to protein ratio of 4:1, and they're typically going to be pretty low in fiber. And again, that is for a specific reason. It is so that you have enough carbohydrates available during a training interval or during a high calorie demand event. That 4:1 ratio is what's considered ideal for energy expenditure, providing enough energy to the body so that you can continue mission. But what most people experience is a lot of digestive distress when consuming foods like this. So that's something to be prepared for when you get to the active phase of the selection process. In the proactive stage, before you go off, having good bowel habits can help you when you get into that situation. It's that adage of, if something's bad when you start, it's probably going to be worse as you go along. So we want to make sure that those foundational things are taken care of before you get into that high stress situation, because you are going to be taking in less calories than you're burning in selection. And so that's just going to add to your physiological stress load. When that physiological stress load is high, your immune system oftentimes is going to take a hit, and you add into that sleep deprivation, you add into that low calorie intake. This can really set you up for some immune related issues as you're going through that process. Now, in the post-selection process, regardless of outcome, there is definitely going to be some gut related issues probably happening. And this is usually going to be anywhere on the spectrum between constipation and diarrhea, lots of bloating, gas, etc. And so even in the recovery phase, we want to address the gut and thereby your immune system. Coming out of a stressful event, you are going to be more susceptible to things like respiratory infections, common colds. I often see where people will get sick more frequently after an intense event like that. So we want to make sure that, again, we're supporting the immune system. And so this is where you want to think about making sure that you're getting in the vitamins and the minerals that you might have been running short on during selection. If you weren't taking a multivitamin prior to going into selection, it's always a good idea to start taking them and replenish some of those micronutrients. Some of the things we want to avoid in the post-selection recovery period is going to be intake of high amounts of alcohol. Yes, I know we want to celebrate sometimes, but remember that alcohol is extremely inflammatory. And so if there's some things going on with the body coming out of a stressed event, coming out in a stressed state, adding alcohol to an already inflamed body is simply adding gasoline to the fire. So we want to be careful with that. Give yourself adequate recovery time. In many cases, you're probably just going to be too tired for the first few days or even couple of weeks to even think about celebrating. Here again, we're going to want to start working in our probiotic foods, our prebiotic foods. Getting adequate sleep is absolutely going to enhance your immune resiliency And so during the recovery process, we want to get back on a good sleep schedule. Health and gut mediated inflammation and immunity is such a huge topic. I've been fortunate to be able to teach on it a little bit in some of my small groups. And hopefully, what we've talked about here today can help you as you're going through the process. The things that you need to do to incorporate good gut health and therefore better immune resiliency are fairly simple and easy to do. All right, so in our next part 3, we are going to be discussing how to periodize your nutrition in preparation for selection. So I will see you there.